Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. And as the introduction mentioned, I feel like I need to make that preliminary stipulation every single time I make an appearance in the primarily historic conference. So I'm not a historian by training, as you've heard, but I am a sociologist, specifically a sociologist of memory. Yet the more I speak to a crowd of historians, the more actually I become comfortable, because the actual discipline that I'm dealing with is very much a discipline that I very much like to use the word diachronic, which means that it takes into societal phenomena and analyzes they change through time. So obviously time is your domain, but I kind of like to contribute into your academic space. And as you can see already from the title of my presentation, I'm going to speak of a very important anniversary that is going to take place throughout the entire year of 2018, but it's a bit of a counterintuitive comparison to all the other presentations that we've heard so far, because for Poland, 1918 is not so much the end of World War I, but it's the moment in which Poland, following 123 years of being non-existent on the map of Europe, regains its independence. So the 100 years of today, it's a title in which I attempted to squeeze in the actual essence of my presentation, which is going to be the meta-memory of the 100 years of independence. So in other words, I'm going to speak very much, not so much about how the moment of independence is being commemorated by the current Polish government and present-day Polish politics, but the actual ways in which the memory has been preserved and the independence from 1918 was commemorated in before. So you can call it meta-memory, you can call it memory squared if you prefer, there are different ways of interpreting that. And as you can see, this is as it was rightly pointed out, this is the official logo of the Polish centennial anniversaries. And a bit of explanation here. I don't know whether it transpires, but it's supposed to communicate the message of Poland being eternally independent or infinitely independent. So a word of caution: if you plan to invade Poland, beware, because we're eternal now. So I don't think that's going to work. But before I actually move to the essence of my presentation, I feel like I'm obliged to give you a handful of theoretical and methodological tools from sociology of memory for you to have a better understanding of my actual research. So since I do mostly collective memory and mnemonic conflicts, or memory conflicts, the first question that one needs to ask in this context is, can we avoid a memory conflict within a group of human beings, be it a community, being a group of colleagues in a work team, be it a football team, be it a society? So the answer that sociology of memory gives to that question is that neither practically nor theoretically it is possible to have no conflict over certain aspects of a collective memory within a community of human beings. But this is not to say that people don't try, because people keep trying to have a very totalitarian approach to collective memory, and people will be trying, I think, but from both perspectives, this is pretty much impossible. But even though it is impossible to avoid mnemonic conflict, and they are perennial to every larger community of human beings, they do vary, and they're very diverse. They pretty much differ in scope, in intensity, in the reasons of origin, and you name it, a huge variety of different reasons. And the best, perhaps, for anyone who be interested to pursue research in that area, the best universe of case studies to see the differences between the scales and intensities of the memory in question, because this is essentially what a memory conflict is about, is any kind of group of states that has any kind of non-democratic past behind it. So Central and Eastern European countries after the 1989 transition, or the countries of Southern Con, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay after the right-wing military dictatorships. So In terms of Poland, which is the primary case study for this presentation and one of the two case studies I focus in my PhD, the other one being Chile, which is also an interesting comparison for scholars of memory. Poland is a very peculiar memory regime, and Poland is has a very peculiar memory conflict, because for most of the post-transitional realm, Poland was a country that faced a total abnegation of memory politics. So in simple terms, in other words, most of the post-communist, leftist, liberal, democratic governments up until pretty much 2015 deemed the area of memory politics and history politics completely politically unrewarding. So in short and simple terms, there was, in their point of view, there was more to lose than to gain, in a, especially in the four-year electoral perspective. So simply the Polish approach to memory and the Polish approach to collective memory was no approach at all, which is also an approach, but let's leave it out there for discussion later. And a very simple process within the Polish society followed. An abnegation of memory created a complete absence of state narratives in terms of the official historical interpretation of different paramount moments of Polish history. That again creates a vacuum, and then the vacuum allows for conflictive interpretations within conflictive groups of Polish society, say more left-wing, more right-wing, more centrist, to emerge and then compete. And that was actually the case up until 2015, which, as many of you know if you follow Polish politics, is the moment in which the conservative law and justice government regains power, and this is the moment in which memory politics is reintroduced atop the policy-making agenda, is actually a primary tool in shaping the identity politics. And in order to illustrate the vacuum I was talking about, here's a very illustrative quote by Tony Judd, who is obviously a very renowned historian of the 20th century, but not many people know that he actually did a lot of writing about memory. And if you haven't read, I highly recommend The Past is Another Country, which is a very constructivist essay, because it suggests that past is not tangible, past that doesn't exist, past is what you make of it. And it says the countries of Central and Eastern Europe suffer from a certain interregnum of collective memories, where old narratives had to be dismissed, taboos were broken, but new narratives were still to be established. And a good example of that is, for example, the Katyn massacre of 1940, or even the very topic of Holocaust. And what happens in 2015? In 2015, we have a conservative government taking over power in Poland, and that's actually a theoretical contribution from my own thesis. Law and justice quickly becomes a very peculiar, practically unknown, unseen before type of memory actor, a memory entrepreneur, so to speak. So the main features, I'm just going to briefly go through them because we've got more important things to discuss in the presentation. You can all read them. It's a very totalitarian kind of interpretation of collective memory, because the approach to politics of history and politics of memory within the current Polish government is that, I think it's best illustrated by the quote, that the problems of the present and the future cannot be effectively addressed unless the whole polity, the whole community is set on the proper foundations constructed according to the true visions of history, which they themselves obviously perceive as being properties of. And the alternative ones need to be destroyed and delegitimized. So this is practically everything that you need to know about the state of Polish collective memory and history at the moment. Past, present, and future blur into one. And what does it mean in practice? In practice means that the 1989 transition and the entire compromise was a rotten compromise betrayal that doesn't really bring about any kind of democratic change. It's just a change of labels. And as a result, Poland begins to regain sovereignty, not independence. That's important to know. It might have been independent since 1989, but it wasn't sovereign because obviously there was a foreign, Russian, Berlin, Brussels axis of domination. It begins to regain sovereignty with Law and Justice winning the elections. And what happens with the moment in which Law and Justice wins the elections? We have a massive enlargement of the memory conflict. And I know that you probably enjoy my sophisticated drawings here. It's a three-dimensional model of enlargement of the memory conflict, because we see the memory being in question, expanding pretty much in all possible directions. So it has to be a three-dimensional model. In short, because I'm going to only speak about one of the axes, we see a widening in scope, so reinterpretation from a memory angle of non-memory areas. And for instance, Polish foreign policy is now being pretty much led by principles of politics of memory, which has never been the case since 1989. Then we see enlarging in depth, more personal protagonist-level disputes, more local revisionism. So we no longer speak to the nameless groups of people, but we identify them name by name and then rehabilitate them name by name. And the most important one, of which the centennial memory initiatives will be a perennial example of, is the expanding in time, so memory layering and older and older and older events being part of the present-day politics. So before, if there was any kind of historical event that would go into the present-day political debate, that would be usually the transition. Then it started going further back in time with the papal visit in the 70s, then the riots, the 50s, the Warsaw Uprising, and now we've reached as far back in time as a century ago. So I wonder where this is actually going to end, because Poland has a lot of history to go to backwards. And another thing that serves as a background, a quick timeline of the memory of independence. So as you know, Poland regains independence on the 11th of November 1918, which is also an interesting overlap of dates, because it's a Veterans Day in most of the Anglo-Saxon countries, but it's an Independence Day for Poland at the same time. So the very initial, the Second Republic before Second World War celebrates that day as a memory of a common effort to regain independence of Poland being divided via partitions into three different, like the area of Poland was divided under the reign of three different countries and three different empires, and it all just brings together by a common effort. Obviously, under the occupation of the Soviets and the Nazis, practicing that memory was completely forbidden, and then the date of the 11th of November disappears completely from the calendar of the Polish bank holidays, because a new Independence Day is proclaimed for the 22nd of July, which is the date of the establishment of the communist regime in Lublin in Poland, and this is the actual Independence Day of Poland, so practicing the memory of the 11th of November is no longer allowed and is actually punishable as a criminal offense. And here we go to the actual essence of the relevance of the memory of the transition, memory of the independence to the present day politics, because in the 1980s, when the Solidarity Trade Union started its massive awakening and started to actually mobilize more and more people, and it peaked 10 million members, at its highest position for a time. The societal awareness of Independence Day is actually being gradually reintroduced, because what Solidarity does is, in order to differentiate itself in terms of symbolic narrative from the communist authorities, it brings back all the pre-war symbolism as a point of reference towards the kind of country that they would like to see or they would like to establish once the communist authorities are gone. And celebrations of Independence Day are seen not just as an act of memory, as a commemorative practice, so to speak, but also an act of disobedience towards communist authority. So this is actually the very first instance of memory layering, a phenomenon in sociology of memory that refers to different historical events having seemingly no direct relation between one another, but being put into one kind of commemorative interpretation and being forcibly interpreted from a linear narrative. So back then in the 80s, if someone actually practiced the memory of 1918 of the 11th of November, that would be seen much more actually as an act of disobedience and loyalty to solidarity, so through the lenses of the present day politics back then, than the actual commemorative ritual of the independence. And then we obviously have the 1989 transition. One of the very first decisions of the first Polish democratic government is to reestablish the 11th as the official national bank holiday. And memory of the 1918 independence in today, and I think I will have to come back to the previous slide, and as we showed you, being the law and justice as a completely totalitarian, so to speak, actor in terms of memory creation, we see past, present, and future blur into one, and then the problems of the present and the future need to be put, so to speak, shelved or put away to the moment in which we set our past on the right track. And because the very founding principle of identity politics of the current Polish government is that practically the 1989 transition didn't happen at all, because it was very much a change of labels. If we go to this slide, that actually becomes much more logical to see why there's a sign of equation between 1918 and 2015, because that was the moment in which Poland regained independence, and according to the current narrative of the Polish government, this is again the moment in which Poland regains the true independence and the true sovereignty, and is actually a sovereign country allowed to make decisions on its own. And what follows that, that's a very simple line of reasoning. So the fight of independence was is equal to the fight against the liberals and post-communists, and the measures that were legitimate to be used in the moment in which Poland recreated its independence 100 years ago are very much measures that are also legitimate to use in any kind of social practice these days. And in order to show you to what extent they actually synonymize themselves with any sorts of anti-communist or independentist memory, I'm going to show you the quote by one of the MPs of the ruling Law and Justice Party, and I've highlighted in bold the instances in which you see the memory layering. So you see the clashes on Krakowskie Przedmieście, which is the parade street of Warsaw, and provocations on behalf of the opposition, the current opposition, are no different from the Secret Service actions during the martial law introduced in 1981. The officers of the Secret Services were no different from those who are attacking us now. What is being done towards us is no different from the repressions during martial law and after 1945 with regard to the Kursk soldiers. And Kursk soldiers were essentially Polish guerrilla fighters that refused to give up arms once the communist regime was established. What is happening now is an effect of history. These people need to pay. Those who manipulate and attack us are people who inherited the political practices of the communist secret services. So you just, by the sheer number of how many times the phrase "no different" appears in this interview, you can kind of get the sense of how much of a memory layering and 100 years of opposition squeezed into one there is actually in the present-day Polish conflict. So coming back to the memory of independence, in the entire public discourse of referring to Poland regaining independence in 1989, there's hardly any mention of the actual moment in which Poland regained independence and Marshal Piłsudski became the first statesman to re-establish the Polish state. There's much more talk about how the memory of independence was preserved and how much of a heroic action it was to maintain the memory of the 11th of November throughout the years of the communist regime. So, between 1945 and 1989, commemoration of the independence was very much seen as a rebellion against the communist regime, but we need to also remember that it was an act of very much a repressed practice. So you could go to jail for a significant period of time for manifesting your affiliation as a Pole on that day particularly. So following again a very simple reasoning from the identity politics of the Polish government, so those who cultivate the memory against all odds were those just like the people in the 40s, 30s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on and so on, are pretty much the same kind of people as those who cultivate the memory against all odds today. And those people who are referred to as the present warriors of the independence are especially the Polish nationalists and the whole vast array of Polish far-right groups that are mushrooming one after the other these days and having completely different, supposedly different institutional affiliations, but they just all come under one umbrella. So in simple terms, because we see the huge sign of equation between the fight of independence in 1918 and the complete abnegation of any kind of success of the democratic transition and the benefits of the democratic changes, then we see a reasoning that in a way goes along the lines of a principle that because we feel like we need to make heroes out of ourselves and there's virtually no war going on, so let's create a war within a war ourselves within the country, because you need to gain your heroship, so to speak, at a certain instance. And to show you to what extent that it actually translates into present-day politics, I'm going to show you just, or briefly walk you through 3 examples of the initiatives of present-day politics that have nothing to do with any kind of historical reference, but which actually use the moment of celebrating the 100 years of independence as an argument for the introduction of certain bills. So foreign policy, as I said, is being conducted very much through the lenses of memory, and we had a very controversial idea last year in which the head of Interior Ministry proposed in order to commemorate the 100 years of independence, Poland was supposed to issue a new design of its passports, and the passports were supposed to feature watermarks of the Gate of Dawn in Vilnius and the Orient, the Eagles of Lviv. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, and the Eagles of Lviv cemetery. So in other words, Polish passports were supposed to feature images of monuments in areas that are now part of Lithuania and Ukraine. You can only imagine how much of diplomatic controversy that would have been. Possible changes of electoral law, that's less important, but the most important thing is that the constitutional referendum might actually take place on the exact day of the commemoration, which is 11th of November, because that's constitutionally one of the few weekends in which the president is actually legally allowed to call for a referendum. And the only thing that the current governing party is short of is a constitutional majority, and they've been trying actively to bypass the existing constitution and seeking enough support to actually have a referendum. And the good legitimization for a constitutional change is just the fact that Poland becomes 100 years old this year, so it's a good opportunity for us to rewrite our constitution from scratch. And to finish on a lighter note, I wanted to show you something that kind of sums up the entire debate about Poland having its politics of the past as an integral part of the politics of the present. And I don't know if you follow Polish politics, but there's yet another controversy, because we can apparently go a week without one, between Poland, the US, and Israel, because no more than 6 days ago, the Polish parliament passed a new bill that criminalizes, under penalty of 3 years, in jail, the use of the phrase Polish death camps, and that was supposed to obviously fight with misinformation and the use of the phrase Polish death camps with relation to places like Auschwitz or Palmyra or any other death camp established by the Nazi regime. And there's obviously a huge repercussion on behalf of the Israeli government, because the Israeli government believes that this is obviously a window of opportunity to negate historical truth. So the controversy is ongoing, and a picture taken just this morning by one of the most prominent members of parliament from the ruling party that's obviously defending the law, and he tweeted, "Poland is not using this law to rewrite history, Poland will use this law to correct it." And on that note, thank you very much.